We are taking you behind the scenes of the National Institute for Data Science and Artificial Intelligence.
With unprecedented access to the scientists pushing boundaries and shaping our future, this show will take you to the cutting edge and beyond.
And whether you're an expert yourself or just science curious, this is the show for you.
Welcome to the Turing podcast.
Hi everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Turing podcast. I'm Jo, and I'm here with my co-host B. Hi B.
Hello.
So today we have a special guest on the show. Well, today we have Tom Mustell. So Tom has just presented the February 2023 Turing Lecture on how to speak whale.
Yes, and Tom is an award-winning wildlife filmmaker and writer who has worked with some people that our listeners might know, as David Attenborough or Greta Thunberg. But let's get started. So Tom, hello, welcome.
Hello, thank you.
You became interested in whales after having a close encounter with a humpback whale in California, 2015. I believe. Can you tell us a little bit about your story and how you get to where you are now and everything?
Just all of that?
Yeah.
Okay. So I was kayaking with a friend and a humpback whale jumped out of the sea and landed on top of me in what's called a breach. And we both were very lucky to survive. And afterwards, in a very strange coincidence, somebody filmed it. And because of that, scientists were able to analyze the footage and find out a lot about both what happened that day and about that whale. And for me, that was my background is I'm a biologist by training and have been a wildlife filmmaker ever since then. And I didn't really know anything about AI before, but after this whale jumped onto us, they used artificial intelligence to find out who the whale was, who its mother was, where it was born. And I've just been finding out more and more about their lives ever since. And it's brought me into this very strange world that we're inhabiting now, where machine intelligence is drawing our attention to animal intelligence and patterns in nature that otherwise we couldn't see. And I find that absolutely fascinating. But also as a conservation biologist, I find it really, really important because it's so powerful.
So you kind of touched upon how AI can help us see patterns in nature, but specifically, how can AI and technology help us in the world of animal communication?
Well, an enormous oversimplification, but a biologist is really a pattern-finding machine. When I go out into a forest and I try and notice animal behavior, I look for patterns. Firstly, where are the animals? What kind are they? How long have they been there? How do they relate to each other? And when I try and follow their communications, I need to record those communications and I need to find patterns within them and then figure out how those patterns relate to everything else that's going on. We now have machines that can do many of those functions. And unlike me, those machines can sit in hundreds of places at the same time, recording 24 hours a day for years and years and years. And they have processes for analyzing the recordings that my brain doesn't, that are specialized for finding patterns at scales that human brains can't experience. So when it comes to communication, an enormous problem for human scientists is that we don't know where to start when unpicking the communications of other species. Do they have something like language? If they do, is it arranged like our language? Is it meaningful? Are there units like phonemes in human language which are meaningless, but when combined together in different orders suddenly acquire meaning? And when you place those phonemes together into words and then you put those words into sentences and you apply syntax to those sentences, you change the meaning. Would other animals communicate in ways like this? For centuries, we've thought that other animals don't communicate at all, and most philosophers have just decided that animals are unspeaking. But this seems to be a very foolish thing to assume without having studied them. Some of the recent advances in natural language processing, which is a field of machine learning, especially with deep learning tools, have been really surprising in their ability to translate between human languages and discover patterns in massive datasets that no human being could experience or parse. There's something which your listeners might know about, which is called embedding, which is when you arrange units within a natural language in relation to one another and how they're used, how often they're used, and how they're used in relation to the other units. And you embed them into, a metaphor is a sort of galaxy with words, for instance, where every word in that galaxy of placements is sort of a set distance from other words according to how often they're used and with them. Now, we can only think in 3 dimensions, but some of these programs can embed in thousands of dimensions, and so can perceive patterns in the arrangements of these embeddings that we ourselves can't. We learn our language by trial and error, by being taught rules, by being exposed to it. And we perceive patterns through being trained by other people, and by noticing the efficacy of it. We talk, we try and speak, we're corrected. And most of the time, we don't actually understand what other people are saying until we've sort of said, oh, do you mean this? Do you mean that? Do you mean this? These programs don't need to be trained. They don't need to be helped. A really strange part of it is that natural language embedding has taken off in recent years without supervision. So if you just feed a huge amount of spoken or written English into one of these programs, and then you do the same with Urdu or Spanish, and then you get your sort of embedded galaxy cloud of all. This is an enormous sort of metaphor simplification. Your embedded galaxy cloud of all the relationships between those words or other elements of those languages. You get this huge, complex, unimaginable shape. And the big discovery has been that there are commonalities between the shapes, between languages, and that if you do a sort of giant Tetris on the galaxy word cloud of English and sort of scrunch it over until it fits the shapes within the galaxy word cloud of Urdu, you will find things that represent the same meaningful units with the same relationships to one another in those languages. Say you will find the shape of the relationships between king, queen, boy, girl in those different languages. And the upshot of this is that you can translate between different human languages using a computer without ever having to tell the computer that it has a language in front of it, what the rules of those languages are, and without ever giving it a dictionary or helping it. And that's how Google Translate works. And it's incredibly powerful, really surprising because nobody thought it would work this well. And it has given rise to a lot of hope in animal communication people, because what will happen when we take we're animals, what happens when we take these pattern tools and apply them to non-human animal communications? We know that pattern finding tools can help us identify animal faces. When we've developed those tools for finding patterns to identify human faces, we know we can take gait analyses tools that are developed on seeing how people walk around, and we can apply them to look at fruit flies and rats. And we know that we can take pretty much every other tool we've developed for finding patterns in human animals, and we can use them to analyze the patterns in non-human animals. So will this work with non-human communications? We don't know. We don't know if such a thing as language exists outside of humans, but with whales and dolphins, and with some other species that are highly vocal, that are highly social, that live long lives, that need to use communication to coordinate their complicated behaviors and intentions, that pass tests in captivity for consciousness, that can learn human sign languages and ersatz signal languages. It seems like pretty hopeful that there might be. That was a really long answer.
But it's great. You covered several points.
It's very complicated though, isn't it? I mean, the problem is when you've just spent like years researching a book, I'm like, let me answer that really simply. And then I'm like, blah.
I mean, anyone that's ever done any research on anything,
right?
Actually, like how you talk about it, how you communicate it is so hard.
I mean, literally, as I was saying all that stuff, like there were like inside my head, like asterisks just popping up. Not in this case. Well, you've got to explain this and this. So I was like,
it's like with this caveat.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So like basically there's a whole bunch of invisible caveats to that too. But you'll have to read my book, How to Speak Whale, to go deep.
So we're talking about communicating with other species and everything, but I bet every human would just want to communicate with their pet first and foremost.
Yes. So you said this, and I think that maybe they wouldn't, because right now every single dog and cat owner believes that their dog and cat loves them. What are the chances that 100% of every dog and cat loves their owner? What if you could understand what your pet was saying and it was saying, I prefer your neighbor? Would you still want to pick up its poo in the park? How would our relationships with other animals break down with a bit of real talk? You know, a lot of people buy pets because they want like unconditional love. Should we expect unconditional love from any sentient being?
Not from a cat.
I was going to say cat owners know this.
You're right.
Yeah.
Their cat's just like, lie down long enough and I'll start to eat you.
Yeah, and sometimes they just rehome themselves. They're like,
That's true.
See ya.
I think that's it. Probably think the dog owners would be upset. I expected more from you. But the cat owners would be like, yes, I knew it all along.
We just know.
You're totally right.
So when you're talking about communication, you're talking about sound rather than gesture. So can AI kind of interpret gesture? And, you know, obviously language and communication, language is one element of it.
Well, I guess there's a sort of wider question, which is like, to be able to analyze something and try and find patterns in it, you must be able to capture the meaningful part of it. So if you were to just film loads of honeybees, but you filmed them at 1 frame a second, you'd miss all of their waggle dances and you'd miss their pheromone signals, and you'd miss the context of what those dances related to. So you can record a lot of stuff and you can run analyses programs on them, and then you can totally miss the meaning, if there is meaning in there. So with the natural language processing tools, they were mainly designed for text or used for text first, but they now work with spoken English and other languages. To relate this back to whales, like all animals really, are multimodal. Like as we're talking now, if I say whales are multimodal, it comes across quite differently from whales are multimodal to whales are multimodal. I'm closing my eyes. Like all of these things are sort of relating that sentence to you slightly differently. I mean, maybe a better example is if I said like, I really like you. Or, I really like you. Like, you know, it's exactly the same sentence, very different meaning. If you knew who we were, that adds a new layer of meaning to it as well. So it's very problematic to separate out, even if you can capture all of the meaningful units, if they do carry meaning, from their context. And so with animal behavior, a lot of the work now is trying to capture as much of the other stuff, I guess you'd call it maybe the metadata, as possible. Like, who is speaking? What else is happening? If you're a whale, who are you communicating with? Is it your mother? Is it a rival? Are there predators around? What's the sea state? How old are you? What sea do you live in? What condition are you in? Are you ill? How long have you lived there for? Are you migrating? What is your, like, if you're a sperm whale, what acoustic clan do you belong to? All of these things. If you're a baby, how long have you been vocalizing for? All of these bits of information are really, really helpful because this is just the beginning of starting to attempt to decode animal communicative interactions. I think, like, for a long time, we've just decided that animals don't have language. And I feel like that has closed us off to investigating whether animals have language, but we just haven't had these tools. And I feel the temptation sometimes is to leap straight into, well, all right, then what language have they got? And how soon are we going to find it? But like, we have only been able to capture the voices of other living creatures for 100 years or so, you know? So for centuries, and also until the last century, the study of other species has been mainly the study of bodies. You know, here we are in the British Library. There's next to the British Library in the Turing Institute, there is an acoustic library here too that has recordings of human dialects and voices and the sounds of animals and nature. But that only stretches back until really the end of the 19th century. Before then, nobody could capture any human voices. Everything was written down or pictures. And if you were studying animals, 120 years ago, you couldn't bring back a bird song and try and decode it or share it with somebody else who might be better at doing that. You could just shoot the bird or paint a picture of it or get its feathers or stuff it and bring home its body. You go to the Natural History Museum, it's a museum of skeletons and specimens. And that's because we have lacked the ability to capture anything beyond bodies. Now we're in an age where we can capture what bodies do. How do they interact? How do they move? How do they communicate with one another? What are the information flows, the swarm dynamics? And it's so much more exciting, but nobody is really ready for this. The Natural History Museum hasn't got like a plan for like storing all of the animal body, as far as I know. I spoke to a couple of the curators there, body movements of all of the species. But I wouldn't be surprised to bring it back in a huge loop to your question, if in 20 years' time you go to the Natural History Museum and you're dragging your 5-year-old, and instead of saying, Daddy, Daddy, I want to go see the tiger skeleton, they say, Daddy, Daddy, I want to go and be inside the tiger movement, or I want to, listen in on the bird conversation. Because once we have these, we're sort of struggling at this early point where we've just figured out how to capture these things. But what do we do with them? How do we relate them to each other?
I think this brings it really closely to the next question, to the next couple of questions, actually, that we had, because it's about what to do with this. And how do you think that being able to decipher all of this communication and all of this non-anatomical knowledge can change the relationships that we have with animals, how we look at them and at the world in general?
Well, the philosopher Jonathan Ledgard believes that we're entering what he calls the interspecies age, that our relationships with other animals are already changing drastically. And you can probably see this in your own family. Like if you were to ask one of your grandparents, like would they have considered their pets a member of their family? They probably wouldn't have thought so, but ask most people in the street today and they will spend thousands of pounds on expensive operations for their cats and dogs. They will think of them as companion animals rather than tools for guarding and herding and pest control. There are people who choose to eat different things based on what the experience of the animals will be like and what they want to happen to the world. So our attitudes towards other species are already changing enormously dramatically, but very unevenly. And I think a lot of that's to do with what we're used to in our cultures and the opportunities in front of us. How this might change with machines and pattern finding engines. Well, I mean, one way of thinking about it is that one of the big drivers of how we relate to other species as we're increasingly urbanized is television or Instagram or, basically visual media. A lot of people don't get to experience orangutans directly, but they care about orangutans, donate money to orangutans, change the biscuit type they eat because of orangutans, because of pattern recording tools called film cameras and pattern transmission tools called like the internet and Instagram. So these things are already happening. Often, as a wildlife filmmaker, with my other hat on, we look to how to connect people to the natural world. How would somebody who doesn't know anything about the living system or individual you're going to show them relate to it? As a conservationist, why should they care? And what element of that animal's life would they most relate to? Famous example from history was with the discovery that whales sing. In the peak of industrial whaling, as we slaughtered hundreds of thousands of them a year, we discovered that humpback whales sing. And when we spread those songs to other people and they heard them, this galvanized the Save the Whales movement. It helped begin Greenpeace. And we, in the end, decided as a culture overall, mostly, to stop hunting whales. That was an empathy tool. We weren't given new statistics about how many whales were dying. We weren't given scientific periodicals that analyzed them. We were played a song and we related to that song because you recognized in it something that was similar to ourselves. And when you recognize something of yourself in another, it helps you relate to them and want to do something and go out of your way and inconvenience yourself on their behalf. And that applies to people too. When there is a natural disaster, it is not the statistics that move people to donate. It's the photographs of individuals and their stories. As we move from viewing animals as deterministic biological machines to individuals with lives and feelings, I believe that machine learning can play a really powerful role, which is to show us patterns in other animals that we recognize from our own lives. If it is showing us how a mother calls out for her calf when they're separated, that would make me care. I would relate to that. If it shows me how much a chimpanzee enjoys a thunderstorm, I would relate to it. But these tools can also be very dangerous because if the machine learning tools are applied to find the most mineral rich area of that chimpanzee's forest to clear and mine, that is not good for the chimpanzees. And if it shows an abattoir how to process that cow as efficiently as possible, it's not good for the cow either. Did I say cow before?
Yes.
I did, yeah. So I guess essentially, but that's the same. You can use film cameras to tell different stories, and wildlife films help people build empathy with nature, but they can also not. You can make a wildlife film about how dangerous sharks are that make everybody scared of sharks and want to kill sharks. So, but we really struggle at the moment to relate to other animals in some ways. And a lot of the scientists who are using these tools and excited by them, the biologists who are trying to decode animal lives, are doing so because both they find it fascinating and because those animal lives are in dire trouble. And they hope that by understanding those lives better and relating to them better, we'll care. And we really care about words and talking. We think it's really special. Look, we're doing a podcast right now. You're listening to me saying this right now. You care about stories. We care about speech. I think the effect of understanding if animals have language-like communication structures, and having spent 5 or 6 years directly researching this and having spent my career in life thinking about it all the time and spending 20 years now observing animals in the wild, I would think it'd be very strange if they didn't, because they go to a lot of trouble, have a lot of anatomy, have complicated lives. How else are they doing many of the behaviors they're doing? Why would they create these complex streams of sounds to do it? If we could understand what they are saying, what are the societal implications going to be? Because it will rock us. Firstly, we won't be the only speaking animal. That's threatening for a lot of people. It was probably threatening for a lot of people when it was revealed that the Earth was not the center of the solar system or the universe. But none of us care about that today.
Yeah.
I was about to say, the humans are very egocentrical, right?
Very good at thinking we're the most special.
Yeah.
I think we are wed to what we're taught growing up.
Yeah.
And when it feels like everything is changing and another massive thing changes, that's really intimidating. And if it's related, there is no easier way than provoking anger than wobbling somebody's sense of identity or group cohesion. And if we get our sense of identity from being the only speaking animal, and we treat other animals so badly, it really challenges our sense of identity to say, well, neither of those things are right. And humans are not logical. We don't say, oh, thanks so much. That's really helpful. Actually, I'll just change everything. We go, you're wrong. I hate you. How irritating. And having made films with Greta Thunberg, I've experienced this. All she does is express scientific consensus and try and say, maybe we should pay attention to this. The number of people who avidly dislike her is phenomenal. And, she's called a woke snowflake by all of these people, but mostly they're the people who seem really upset by what she's saying. Anyway, this is a side point that I think anything that draws attention to something really important that changes your idea of how you fit into things could be challenging, but also it could be absolutely revealing and wonderful. I saw that William Shatner went up on that space rocket with Jeff Bezos recently. Bezos?
I'm not the native.
He went up in Jeff's rocket recently. I pretend I know him
Our old
personally.
pal Jeff.
With Jeff, friend of the pod. And as when they landed, as Jeff was opening a champagne bottle and beaming, I think William Shatner said something along the lines of that he found it kind of mortifying and terrifying to be up there because he realized the fragility of the Earth looking down at it. So when you have this sudden view of yourself from outside, it changes you. And many of the Apollo astronauts reported this. That's what we as a culture got with the famous pale blue dot photograph taken back at the Earth as this tiny little insignificant seeming pinprick of life in a universe, as far as we know, of non-life. It's scary knowing how you fit into things.
Yeah, very existential, I think, for a lot of people as well.
But this is existential. I think we are the people listening to this podcast are living through an extinction crisis. So we will live to see whether or not the other conscious minds that potentially have ever existed on Earth are snuffed out with us or not. Whoa, that's pretty deep. I find it so boring that we're going and looking at Mars and the moon so much because, as far as I know, they look exactly the same on them from when you stare at them from here with a telescope. I look at the moon with a telescope. I find it very beautiful. It's a white, dusty rock. And here we are in London, where a whale swam up the Thames a few years ago. And if we drive to the sea, we can swim in the same waters as humpback whales, sperm whales, bottlenose dolphins, killer whales. These animals are potentially the only communicative, cultured, conscious organisms with language-like structures that we could ever hope to communicate with in the entire universe, as far as we know. Yet, they wash up dead regularly. Right now, super trawlers are operating in the channel with nets the size of the Eiffel Tower, killing these animals by the dozen. But we're looking at a dead rock. This strikes me as really silly. Sorry, guys.
And how do I follow that? Obviously, very valid point.
Sorry, that was really heavy. I guess what I'd say is it's also so exciting because when else in the history of life on Earth has a species attained this point where perhaps we could actually make contact with another species? And I find it so interesting that it's our technology which is enabling this. And there's really freaky elements to this. For instance, deep learning tools can help us make jokes in different human languages. We can train them, or in fact, we can let them pass huge data sets, discover the kind of blueprint of a joke and make new jokes by themselves. They don't need to be trained to do this. We could potentially make jokes in whale-ish without us even being able to speak whale-ish. Then is that us making the joke in whalish, or is it our algorithm? As this continues further down the line, and there's lots of discussion about alignment in AI, how do we give these these increasingly intelligent tools a value system, so they don't turn us all into paper clips or, grey gunk or everything. A lot of the dudes who invented these tools don't even think animals are interesting. They think the most interesting way to live is to make sure that their brains exist as long as possible and develop computer brains that are like their brains. And if that's on Mars or on Earth, who cares? Either's fine. Be a bit sad if the animals die, but mainly they're good for eating and making nice clean air for us to breathe. That's so boring. Why? And they always talk, every time I read an AI article, it always has some deep learning researcher or saying, humans are the most intelligent things ever. Apart from the thing I'm making, I'm scared that thing will become so powerful. And I'm like, what about the hundreds, millions of other intelligences on this planet around you? How do you know? You spent your life at a desk. You've never spent your life investigating other intelligences. And you certainly haven't worried about imbuing a value system for the rest of the living planet into those artificial intelligences.
Yeah, we actually had someone on the podcast. Her research was around kind of perching and birds. So it was she was thinking about how can we change AI systems to learn from the intelligence of other animals that are not just the human brain, because obviously animals have specific things that they know how to do that humans cannot do. So that's a really interesting kind of avenue of AI research that
I think often we're quite limited in our imaginations. We're couldn't they do the things we don't do well better? They might be able to do things we can't even conceptualize. In fact, they can. They can see spectrums of light we can't see. They can hear frequencies of sound we can't see.
They can fly.
They live in places that we can't go, where the density is different. They live in different mediums. Some of them can live for orders of magnitude longer than us. Some of them can experience time at different scales from us. Some of them have senses that we don't even comprehend, like electromagnetic senses. How can we even make any quick judgment about how their intelligences and cognitive abilities relate to us? And whose experience of life on Earth is more valid?
Or more superior.
And I think this is a big change that's happened since I studied biology at uni, that no longer do we talk about intelligence as being a sort of scale, that we're now, and it's so much more fun because instead of saying oh, how clever is it? Is that parrot as clever as a person? Though I would say Nick Bostrom is not we're
always the point of reference, aren't we? Or historically.
Well, I saw a graph the other day that was in one of these AGI things when it was here is a line, and here is a bacteria, and here's a fly, and here's a chimp, and way over here is a person, and way past that person is an AGI. Be scared. I'm like, dude, it's a tree. It's it's not a line. There are and I just think that's a really frustrating bit because I feel there's so much overlap between the creation of novel intelligence and the understanding of what intelligence could be. And we now understand that it's not does this animal sense like us? It's what sense world does this animal have? Does this animal think like us?
How do they see the world?
How do they see it? How does that relate to us? Does it overlap with us? And if it doesn't, what insight does that give us? How else could we more complete our known to be incomplete picture of existence.
Because we just have a very human definition of everything. Intelligence is defined by the human scale.
I mean, we can't even define intelligence.
Exactly.
We can
That's
define
the thing.
Yeah, and therefore I suppose as a result of that, AI, what we've created, in an AI perspective, is just doing things that humans do, like better and faster, but it's human things. I think it's a very interesting kind of avenue of thought and conversation in the sphere of artificial intelligence.
And they're just human things now. Remember that the human things that we're focused on with many of our AI tools are just the particular fixations of our current culture. Computer games, they're really interesting and they're really complicated and a fantastic way of looking at whether something can solve lots of different problems quickly and, with different levels of what it knows and what it doesn't know. But I think at different points in human history, we've been very interested in different things.
Yeah.
How could an AGI meditate?
Yeah.
How could an AI meditate? Like, how do you, for these more subtle things where we don't have ranking systems for who wins or loses, how do you benchmark thought or cognition in a non-human system when we can't even benchmark it in a human system?
Yeah, it's really interesting. So to kind of bring it back to whales, communicating with us.
We're just going to stay miles away in this weird stuff. You shouldn't
talk about whales. So the technology exists or is emerging that for us to be able to communicate with whales. The question is, flip side of the coin, should we be doing that? Can they consent to us communicating with them, following them, recording them? Like, kind of, what are the ethics around us trying to communicate with whales?
I think this is a huge question. And when I started writing the book and researching it, I felt the big challenge was just to persuade readers to take the question seriously, that we might be able to communicate with another species, or at least find patterns, meaningful patterns within the communications of another species. And I know with recent developments, with like ChatGPT and Bing, and with the algorithmic marking of, exam grades, suddenly we're seeing like how AI features in our lives much more visibly, and we can see how good or bad use can affect us. We still don't know whether other animals will say anything that we could understand, or whether we could say anything that they understand. But what we can do before that, like immediately right now, and it's slightly creepy, is we can deepfake whales. If somebody took the first 30 seconds of this podcast, they could deepfake us and continue sort of sound kind of like us. If you played back the deepfake that it made of us to us later, if we were like in the shower or cooking dinner, we'd be like, holy, what the hell's going on?
We would hate it the same way as we hate our recordings, basically.
Yeah. They'd be like, it doesn't need to be meaningful. We would just hear things we recognize of that conversation. In the same way that, you can use these tools to, if you start playing a piece of music on a piano, it can continue and it can make like variations that sound music-like of that first section. So we can just record a bit of whale and play back to the whales stuff that might be totally meaningless or absolutely terrifying or nonsensical. But we have a bad track record of making contact with between cultures in human culture. And we know that culture is fragile. We know that whale cultures, and the scientists call them cultures, have existed potentially for longer than human vocal cultures, because they've been in the sea talking for potentially 10 million years or more. So they're very inquisitive. Their cultures change. The scientists who study them have watched how they change. Sperm whale cultures change gradually, and they're arranged into acoustic clans. Humpback whale song changes every year. So if we start spraying novel sounds that sound like theirs at them, what will that do? I think we need to know the answer to that question before we start trying to do it. Otherwise, is this a new form of pollution? Is this cultural pollution? And a lot of the scientists who are involved in this work want there to be a wider societal discussion of, as we enter this point in time where we leap quickly from denying that other animals have complex communications to trying to have complex communications with them, should we just hold back and listen for a while? Should we try and understand what it is we're dealing with and what our competencies are, and have a pragmatic approach to it? I think a really interesting analogy is with genetic engineering. So early on, it became apparent that we'd suddenly got the competency to clone humans. And we as a civilization decided that that was a red line we didn't want to cross. We had that competency and we held back from it. I know similar conversations are happening, on a sort of existential terror level with AI alignment and human values. But I think we need to have this conversation now about how we decide to listen? And should we have ambassadors? Should the UN have people who are stakeholders on behalf of the other animal cultures so that we can advocate for them and represent them? We should certainly not let private entities lead this, because we have seen that left unfettered to other elements of nature, like patenting genes or crops or animals or medicine traditions, private entities are totally unscrupulous. And we should be wary of the military implications of this too, because you don't have to have a very complicated signal to suggest bees to leave a country that would destroy its agriculture and food supplies, or indicate to other animals to swim into the cooling pipes of nuclear generators. You know, animals have been used for military purposes since the beginning of time. This is another way of manipulating them, as well as another way of empathetically understanding them. The premise of this book and this area is kind of fun. It's like Dr. Dolittle, and it's so exciting. And I think it is a tool that could be used incredibly positively. And if we decide to just back off it, well, look at the trend of extinction currently. Look at where we're going. We need to use the tools that we can, but it is terrifying to think of how these tools could be misused because nature is on its knees.
Yeah, but this is the point where you have to think about the ethics, isn't it?
Yeah.
You know, we haven't had a great track record, I think, with AI of kind of taking a moment to pause and think about the ethical implications before it's then released into the wild.
Yes.
You know, there's been a lot of conversations around ChatGPT, obviously being the really big one, but, you know, it's kind of like almost the ethical things have been almost an afterthought, I suppose.
Yes. Bridle, the philosopher and writer, excuse me if I really mangle what your sentiment, James, but like, I think he wrote about how, in his book Ways of Being, he wrote about how we shouldn't allow our imagination of what AI should be to be led by the corporate entities who've created the tools.
Yeah.
Like, because if you're just scared because they're scary and you say stop, that's also, I think, a really sort of pathetic response, because that's not engaging with the tools, that's not engaging with the technology, and it doesn't engage with the possibility that these things could be incredibly useful and positive for us. I just don't think they should be in private hands. I don't think they should be used primarily for profit. They should be common goods. And I think where that comes to the domain of like the living world, how could we allow anything to happen in a non-consensus way? Like in the UK, when we had the potential to suddenly change fetal development, so we could like designer embryos. There was a big conversation about designer embryos and about at what stage a pregnancy could be terminated. And these are huge questions prompted by new tech. We could make in vitro fertilized like humans. We could make a person outside of a human body. This was a transformative and extraordinary development that, as soon as it came about, brought a host of deep ethical problems. The people to answer those problems were not the cell biologists who figured out how to do it. They were philosophers, they were lawyers, they were social scientists, and they were members of the public. And that, I think, is the approach that we should have to these things. We have these massive new competencies. No entity should be allowed to own them, and no individual should be allowed to decide how they're used. Boom. Sorry. You shouldn't have given me that massively powerful coffee.
Yeah. No, you're doing our job for us. You're answering questions that we haven't even posed. Because what I wanted to know is, you've obviously been researching research right now, right? How everything is being studied and how it's applied. And you've given a lot of thought about the ethics and what should be done. So how do you think research is going to evolve? You mentioned museums in 20 years, but what about 30 years or 50 years? What jobs do you think are going to exist? What type of research is going to be opened up by all of these technologies? And what can the people that, I don't know, the undergrads today or the kids in school, what jobs will they have, or what research can they do? What type of scientists they can be? I think in the future.
I wish I was like just leaving university now or in 10 years, because the navigation, so swimming in the seas right now are robots that are self-powered using wave and solar energy, self-navigating using GPS systems and analysis of shipping movements, and that carry payloads that can measure anything from ocean acidification to the songs of animals around them. you can place recording devices on the bodies of animals, and we're getting better at placing ones on using subtler tech like drones compared to wanging them on with darts that stay on without harming the animals now for days and days and days. The big challenge of all of these things is that the huge amount of data coming off them. So one challenge is getting the data out of the ocean, for whales, and the other is navigating it. Like, we've never had these data sets before. I think there'll be really interesting jobs in sort of adventuring through the data, like navigating through it. Because at the moment it's got shoved on a hard drive or stuck on Amazon Web Services, and then it's just kind of, what do we do next? I met the Natural History Museum, the curator of mammals, and he talked about, I think he was one of the curators 100 years ago, and he never went out into the wild. He lived in he worked in the Natural History Museum. He lived in the UK, but he named more species of mammals than anybody else because he looked through the things that were sent back to him, and his analysis techniques and the ability he had to find patterns in the bones and bodies of the animals sent back to him allowed him to uncover whole relationships in the tree of life and phylogenetic analysis, not phylogenetic, but the analysis of the family trees of those animals that have held up to the present day because he was so good at combing through what was sent back. So I think the job of biologists might be changing quite a bit from like a sort of grizzly person on a boat with sunburn who's really good at not getting seasick, or like somebody who likes camping and doesn't mind creepy crawlies, to somebody who's really good at exploring remote information and data, a kind of data adventurer. Myself, I would be very bad at that. I'm one of those people who likes getting sunburnt and doesn't like creepy crawlies. But I think, in 30 years' time, 50 years' time, we'll get subtler and subtler at observing living systems and also remotely operating things. I think there are teams making these soft robotic fish that swim around coral reefs and look just like a fish. I mean, imagine being a coral reef fish drone pilot. And that
like a video game.
Like a video game, but in reality.
Yeah.
And unlike drone pilots not bombing people, just like being on a coral reef, but in a way where the other inhabitants of that reef don't notice you, and so they live their normal way. And maybe you've got augmented senses so that you can hear the conversations of the reef fish to each other that are outside of human hearing, and can taste the salinity changing in the water.
Fascinating. Yeah, I want to be coming out of university.
Right.
And I want to change my
But I
But
think
this is happening right now. And remember, the oceans are so unexplored and they are so unprotected. They are just full of mystery. Likewise, the tropical canopies, like the tops of trees, are even less understood than coastal waters. And so forget about Mars. Don't forget Mars. Obviously, like astronomers listening, I'm not trying to be mean. Give some money to the biologists. Why does CERN get so much money to search for things that might not exist? It's cool and it's important, but no subatomic particle is going extinct anytime soon. Neither is Mars. Neither are distant galaxies in the beginning of the universe. So. Right. Well, no, I love space, and that's my big Twitter addiction is space Twitter, and I just find it beautiful, all the imagery and exploration. But the truth is, none of it's going extinct. But the living world is going extinct. Why don't we have enormous institutional, multinational funding things like CERN for animal communication and behavior? We don't. It's mostly just individuals at the moment. The big projects are quite rare.
So call to arms from Tom there.
That's right.
Yeah.
If you're listening.
And you make data science sound so cool. You said adventuring through data, and I'm like, that's my new job description.
Yeah, call yourself a data adventurer. Because I think a lot of these conversations are like, is AI going to do this, or will it replace us? None of these AI tools are going to do anything without human in the whale world, without humans to like lead them, and really what they're doing a lot of the time is just doing human drudgery and drawing attention for humans to look for the next question. So, all of these discoveries come with suites and suites and suites of questions. So the main thing is like, what question are you interested in? Because suddenly we have so many more tools for looking.
So fascinating. So, okay, we're coming to an end of the podcast. Can you tell us a cool whale fact as we draw to a close? So you mentioned something about salmon hats in your lecture. I want to hear more about salmon hats.
Yeah. Well, I can tell you a lot of cool whale facts.
Yes, please do.
Okay, I'm just going to sort of spout as many cool whale facts as I can until you shout stop. Okay.
Pun intended.
Okay, 30 years ago, there was a craze for salmon hats, and the orcas of the Pacific Northwest, they started wearing them. One female started wearing them. No one knew why. Then they all started doing it. Then 3 months later, they stopped. No one knew why. Was it a fashion? No one knows. The orcas off Gibraltar are attacking their rudders right now. They've disabled, I think, over 100 sailing vessels, so much so that the Spanish authorities have said, don't sail there. No one knows why. Their blue whale voices can travel 500 miles, and that's across entire oceans. What does that mean? Like, how could you be solitary? We thought blue whales were solitary if you can hear your mates an ocean away. Are they solitary? Who knows? A really, really cool weird fact is that bowhead whales, we know that they can live for 200 years because some hunters killed one, I think it was about a decade ago, and they found a 150-year-old harpoon in it. And that's how we know, because it was already 50 years before that. Other weird stuff, they have prehensile penises, because they have sex in the sea and you can't push against anything in the sea. So you need to have a penis that's prehensile. Prehensile means it can move around by itself like a tongue.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. That sperm whales make the loudest sound made by any animal, and they think they could use it like a weapon, and they use it in their nose. The first third of a sperm whale is just folded up nose filled with amazing amplifier. A sperm whale rave would be like nothing you could imagine. Inside their flippers are hands. If you dissect out the flippers, you see all the fingers just as you would in your own hand. And if you dissect further down the whale's body, you find its leg bones, because whales used to walk on land and they used to walk alongside our furry, hairy ancestors. And whales still have little hairs on their faces, and when you get close to them, you can see them. What else?
Oh, those are really cool facts.
Yeah, the hand thing really got me in your lecture.
Yeah,
Really,
it's kind of scary, because
like fascinating, but I was like, oh,
yeah, you're like, oh, they're really similar to us. You know? And they have hot blood, and they suckle their young with milk. Oh, breastfeeding in the sea is different. Because so the baby whales have little grooves in their tongues, and they dock like those planes that refuel in the air, and the mothers squirt. They have like really powerful mammary glands, and they actually fire the milk out like a jet. And it's whale milk ice cream would be absolutely delicious because it's got loads more fat in it, because the whale babies have to grow their blubber so fast.
Well, that's a cool fact. I'd never thought about the underwater mammals breastfeeding. That's what makes them mammals, right? So
that's made them able to like conquer the seas. Yeah.
These are really cool facts, and I guess everyone is going to go to their tables and be like, I know a fact. And also regarding the lecture, there will be a video online, I think, of the lecture. So if you want to see a photo of the hand, Tom does show one in the lecture, but you do have to watch the entire lecture, listener, if you were listening. So are there any opportunities for people to get involved in this work?
Yes, this is one of the coolest things. Like, when the humpback whale jumped out of the sea and landed on me and my friend, and the AI tool identified it using patterns on its tail fin, that tool was designed by a man in South Korea who, as far as I know, has never even seen a whale. So one of the biggest, I mean, I think the majority of humanity lives quite close to the sea, but most people don't get chances to see whales very often. That doesn't stop you from finding patterns in whales. So you can contribute as a software designer. You can become a citizen scientist. You can go out and I use an app on my phone called iNaturalist. And when I identify things on my phone, the AI identifies them for me, and then it feeds back into the database. There's a bird song identifier from Cornell University called Merlin. And if you record the birds in your park, it will tell you what species they are. I reckon quite soon it might tell you what individuals they are, because each animal has its own unique voice print. So when you do that, not only do you get helped by your computer, you help the computer because you're adding information into its database. If you're minted, support this research. These scientists are a day late and $1 short. They are not well funded. What is more exciting to fund? A new social media app, discovery of death on Mars, or contact with the only other sentient creature in the universe? That could be your legacy. Do it, guys. If you want to help conservation organizations so that there are sentient animals left to communicate with, march with protesting organizations, sign petitions, mostly just like contribute to the nature that is nearest to you. That's the easiest way to get involved with conservation, is like whatever is nearest to you. If it's a little river, if it's a coastline, if it's your park, if you go in it long enough, you'll see the issues it faces. You'll meet the people who are involved in it. You'll find out how you can contribute. Feel hopeful. Don't feel overwhelmed. That's the other thing.
I think that's a very good. It is hard not to feel overwhelmed, I think, but
yeah.
I think sometimes going out into nature and reminding yourself how wonderful it is a good antidote to that. Well, I find that anyway.
Totally.
Yeah.
And also don't feel like maybe everything is going to go extinct, but maybe there's nothing we can do about it. We don't know. So just being depressed about it is
it's not going to help.
It's not going to help anything. Mm-hmm. And in a way, it's squandering your lifespan, which is an opportunity for experiencing wonder. So use your opportunity for experiencing wonder. That is under your control.
And that's a wonderful note, I think, to finish the podcast
on. No. I'm highly caffeinated and I've got like a whole book full of whale facts, so there's no escape.
So all that's left for me to say is thank you so much for coming on the podcast and chatting to us today, Tom.
Thank you.
My final question is just, where can people find you? I think that means in a kind of internet way, not
postcode.
Not postcode.
I don't want the AGIs to know where to find me because I've just been mean about them.
So if people want to find out more, where can you point them?
I'm on Twitter and Instagram at Tom Mustill. So that's TOM and Mustill is MUSTILL, as my mum would say answering the phone as a child. And I've got a website. Oh, and you can see my films at grippingfilms.com.
Fabulous.
And people can get your book as well.
Oh my goodness. Buy the book. That's the number one way you could help whales, is if you buy my book, How to Speak Whale, out in all good bookstores in 12 languages.
Cool. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode. The show is hosted by me, B. Costa Gomes, Ed Calstry, Joe Dungate, Christina Last, and Anika York. And the episodes are produced by Luca Lane. Music for this podcast is produced by Jam and Sun. You can listen and follow via the link in the description or by searching Jam and Sun on Instagram.